Ecocide is the knowing or foreseeable destruction of an ecological habitat that makes repair or renewal impossible in a foreseeable amount of time. On September 9th of last month, right, September 9th, just 6 weeks ago, the island nations of Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, in a submission to the International Criminal Court, asked that ecocide to be prosecuted as an international crime alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. If successful, the change would allow for the prosecution of individuals who have brought about environmental destruction, such as the heads of corporations or even the heads of state. Think of Bolsonaro encouraging or enabling the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. It was not by chance that it was these three island nations that submitted the proposal for an ecocide convention. The very existence of some South Pacific islands is threatened by climate change. In the case of Samoa, 70% of the population and 70% of the infrastructure of the island is along the coast. And almost certainly they will be inundated, they will all have to move inland, and they will lose their entire tourist industry. But all around the world, coastal areas are threatened with destruction, from Bangladesh to Florida. Climate change is an inadequate description of our present. A slow climate catastrophe would be more accurate, but a slow climate catastrophe that will cause ruination to hundreds of millions of lives across multiple generations, and worse. Climate catastrophe will cause unspeakable numbers of untimely deaths and destruction. At present, 400,000 people a year are dying from climate-related deaths. By 2030, the death toll could rise to 700,000 people per year. The slow unfolding climate catastrophe is in fact a slow genocidal ecocide. The ecocidal destruction of the fabric of Holocene nature that will cause untimely death to millions of Earth's citizens, indeed the most vulnerable Earth citizens, both in the foreseeable future and for centuries to come. And yet we're doing nothing. And yet collective action is not happening. Nothing proportional to the calamity is in sight. So the first question is, how do we understand the lack of action? How do we understand these failures? And I think the failure of action is always related to a failure of perception of possibility. In order to act, you have to see the possibility of action. And possibility involves two dimensions. First, it involves practical possibility. You have to see what you could do to change things. But in fact, we know there are tons of policies about what we could do to deal with climate change. So it's not a lack of practical possibilities. What then is preventing us? Here's my hunch. All human forms of life have been governed by a constellation of values, a value horizon, a set of values that provide a sense of social cohesion, and the social cohesion allows for social action. What we lack at the moment are an adequate value horizon that would be an alternative to the one of liberal capitalism. Liberal capitalism is a failed and failing form of life. It is a failed form of life because it has destroyed the material, natural conditions for the possibility of social reproduction. It has literally undone its own material conditions of possibility by polluting the earth, by polluting the atmosphere, by creating climate catastrophe. It is a failing form of life because an inaugural principle of liberal capitalism has been human equality. And it has utterly betrayed that promise that all individuals will be equal. Liberal capitalism plainly lacks the ethical resources and political motivation to respond to the climate catastrophe unfolding before our eyes, and it is, on the contrary, continuing a path, visibly a path of continuing destruction. Liberal capitalism, I want to suggest, is a death drive. And that's what I think my students perceive when they do not act. They see that this is going ahead, that not self-interest, nothing is going to stop it, and nobody in power cares, and there's no way of perceiving a future. We need a new beginning. We need to figure out how to begin again. We need, at the very least, a new value horizon that can motivate political action to respond. So we need to change the conversation. We need to move from talking about, as everyone talks about, inequality and climate change. Climate change. I lived in England for a long time, and everyone in England says, oh, if you don't like the weather, wait, it will change in 5 minutes. Climate change is just change. We're not living through climate change. We are living through a climate catastrophe, through ecocide, and through slow genocidal ecocide. And we need to bring those thoughts and the understanding appropriate to them into view. So my thought is this, that the foundational principles for a political morality, that is a morality of the polity, which in this case will have to be the international polity, would be an enhanced human rights that would have the status of international law. Indeed, human rights must become the constitutional principles for all international law. And second, there has to be an ecocide convention having the same status again as genocide or crimes against humanity. that would make the protection of the ecological integrity of the earth, or what remains, we might say, of Holocene living nature, to make protecting it a categorical imperative of international law. What international law calls a jus cogens principle. I promise not to use any more Latin. A peremptory law, a compelling law, a law that cannot be derogated. Now, to say the least, I know if you've been alive for the last several decades, I know none of you here really believe in human rights. So I'm going to try to convince you why you should. That's my heavy lift to begin with. Then there's the Ecocide Convention. Okay. The climate catastrophe is an existential threat to collective humanity. And the thought is human rights and an Ecocide Convention together would aim to shift political morality from the local to the global and to ground principles for a new form of life in which we undertake, and this is the phrase I'll use, to share the fate of all Earth citizens. And I'll give anyone who knows the origin of sharing the fate, that phrase, an A+ for the course. Human rights and an Ecocide Convention would be a call to solidarity. So we need, because solidarity is the kind of motive we need in order to undertake the requisite form of action. So the motives would have to be of a kind that would allow us to perceive others as fellow Earth citizens and to act in solidarity with them by acting on these new principles. So the talk has 3 parts. Something about human rights, something about an Ecocide Convention, and something about the two of them together. Two big thoughts underline or govern my conception of human rights. The first is this. Human rights are an historical construction. They're not natural rights, they're not given. They are an historical construction that are constructed and reconstructed over and over again at different times in different places. And let me just offer you to begin with 8 examples of human rights. They began in England with the beginning of capitalism. They began again in 1776 in the United States with the Declaration of Independence. They began again in France in 1789. They began again in Haiti in 1791 or 1804 when the victory was achieved. They began again in Germany in 1796 in Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right. They began again in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They began again in 1966 with the 2 international covenants on civil and political rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights. The 1966 ones are a product. They were written by the former colonial nations. So the 1966 covenants were actually a human rights project for decolonization. They were written again in 1979 with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I can go on and on. They keep getting started again and failing, and starting again and failing, and each time they arise for a reason, notice. They arise against an act of domination and oppression. Human rights always arise as a form or a struggle to overcome domination. In the name of what? In the name of what? Always, underneath, I think, is the sense of human dignity. The sense that each human life is of equal intrinsic worth. My hunch is that the dignitarian thought is the underlying meta-value of modernity that liberal capitalism cannot keep faith with. Second, so it's an historical construction. The second thing that's really interesting about human rights is the deep logical structure is an ethical structure, and the logical structure that is an ethical structure is self-transcending. That sounds like nonsense. Let me see what I can do. Human rights, and this really matters to this story, were born right in the belly of liberal capitalism. And they are fundamental to it. I want to be absolutely clear. Human rights were born with liberal capitalism. Capitalism needed it, and therefore the association of human rights with capitalism is not a mistake. It's only half a story, though. On the account I'm going to give, the structure of human rights leads from liberal capitalism to what I want to call human rights socialism. Socialism, on the reading I would want to give, and we can talk about it, was originally a human rights project. That's how I read Marx's On the Jewish Question. What's this business about a self-transcending structure? In a truly amazing essay by T.H. Marshall called Citizenship and Social Class, written in 1949, Marshall offers what I think is a shocking and revelatory thesis. We always ask the question, especially in philosophy classes, what is human equality? What is human equality? And Marshall has a defiant answer. Human equality is a social production, and it is produced by the idea of equal citizenship, that the only actuality of human equality occurs by processes in which humans become equal citizens. And that's the story of modernity, of progress in equal citizenship. And outside of that, equality has no meaning or sense. I want to be clear, no meaning or even sense, because the actuality is about the life of the citizen. Now, in order to make sense of that thought, we need a sense that all rights are not the same. And Marshall argues, and really nobody really disagrees with this, we need to distinguish between civil rights, political rights, and social rights. Civil rights are simply the fundamental legal protections, security of the person, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. Political rights include things like a fair trial, but also the right to vote, the right to congregate, the right to petition, the right to be active as a citizen. And social rights are the rights to welfare, to education, to health care, to food, to housing, to work, to social security. Marshall only looks at the case of English history. It's a very parochial book, wonderfully parochial. And in England, we can actually identify the moment when each of these rights appeared. So civil rights appear in the 17th and 18th century. I like the French siècle, it's quicker. Political rights in the 19th century, and social rights in the 20th century. Now, the import of this is that rights really were birthed with capitalism and equally with the formation of the modern state. The two things we hate most, they were birthed together, and they were birthed together with rights. And the explanation is very simple. Prior to the modern age, rights and duties went along with social roles. And social roles have been the great historic norm. That's where you get your rights, the rights of a father or mother or chief or hunter or whatever. Social roles provided rights and duties and nothing else. Capitalism begins by throwing people off the land, expropriating the land, and then, we say they have freedom of movement, they were forced to move into cities to find jobs, and now they have no social roles. So how are they going to be protected? Civil rights or legal rights, bare legal rights, were the new infrastructure of capitalism. But they included two fundamental items without which capitalism is impossible, namely property rights and contract rights. So individuals become, at this moment, in a way Paul's written about with respect to Shakespeare, socially naked. This is a real extraordinary moment where you've lost your social roles and there's nothing holding you, making you visible, but suddenly legal rights, very, very minimal sets of protections, very small sense of how the social world is meant to work. I said there's a logic here, and the logic comes about in this way. Why obey the laws? Why obey the laws? The laws are no longer given by the divine right of kings. That's done away with. Laws are plainly given out by secular governments. And who the hell are they? Who are they? And the answer is, well, they're just us. And people begin to realize that laws stem from political power. Laws stem from people. And therefore, the authority of laws is about the will of the people. And it dawned on everyone pretty quickly. Obviously, look at the American Revolution, look at the French Revolution. It didn't take a genius to see. We give the laws to ourselves. That's the modern naked individual rising up and declaring themselves to be self-governing. So political rights give voice for a kind of not only equality under law, but a political equality. Now you might say, oh, come on, that's kind of obvious. Is anyone from France here? Any French citizens? Any Swiss citizens? There's a Swiss? Oh, sorry, France. When did women get the vote in France? Earlier, 1944. 44. In Switzerland, it was 71. Hold it. No, UK was earlier, 1918, 1928 of equality for everyone in England. So but my point is this. Women's equality in France is just about the same age I am. It's very new. We think human equality is obvious, but suffrage is already just 75 years old in lots of places and less in Switzerland. So we are confident about human equality, and yet political equality, the very thing the French Revolution said it was bringing to everyone on the universe, is still fragile, still only partial. Why the French gave women the right in 1944 is kind of obvious. They fought valiantly in the war. They recognized that you can't have people who are fighting with us in the war and then say you're not equal to us. What more could they do for their equality? And the same happens with respect to social rights, because people notice, here's the logic now, how can you vote or be politically active if you're hungry, if you don't have a house, if you don't have education, if you don't have social security, if you don't have water? I mean, social rights are a condition for being active and having political rights. So there's a logic here. Civil rights presuppose political rights because they're the authority, they're the political authority behind political rights, and political rights presuppose social rights. And lo and behold, after World War II, in the United Kingdom, suddenly they were beginning to provide social rights, rights to housing, health care, education for everyone. But this was true throughout Europe. Europe, at a certain moment after World War II, decided everyone deserved civil, political, and social rights. And we don't know what to call this. You could call it the welfare state. You could call it social democracy. Marshall thought it was human rights socialism. That's what he thought equal citizenship was, human rights socialism. And he thought it was about to sweep Europe and indeed sweep the world. Now, the point about World War II, just to make the obvious point, is what made these rights possible was solidarity. They shared one another's fate in the war, and after the war they said, oh, of course, we're going to continue to share one another's fate. How can we not? How could you look the person who you are in the trenches with in the eye and say, no, you don't deserve a home or health care or education? What happened? We're not there. What happened? Two things. The first is this. Marshall simply forgot or ignored that British wealth was built on colonialism and empire. Hence, his notion of socialism stopped with the English Channel or the Atlantic Ocean and went no further. It wasn't universal at all. It was truly the citizenship rights of members of the UK. The second thing that happened was capitalism itself. From the very beginning of the Declaration of Human Rights, the view emerged, particularly from the United States, that civil and political rights were obligatory and social rights were aspirational. Not obligatory. The aspirational character of social rights is what keeps human rights part of capitalism. And it has kept it part of capitalism all along. Even some of my closest friends, Nora O'Neill, has argued this is obligatory, just aspirational. This is the alibi of capitalism that prevents human rights from becoming human rights socialism. This to me is clear. One more step. On the basis of this argument, I think I can give you an account of the meaning and nature of human rights. A philosophical account, if you wish, if this isn't enough. I need one further step for my argument, and the further step comes from Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. It's a book that lots of people are reading at the moment. He is suddenly very much in vogue. And why is he in vogue? For the following reason. Polanyi was an historical economist. And he was also Hungarian and a critic of Lukács. He thought Marx had made a mistake, and Lukács had made the mistake worse by claiming that history is the history of class conflict, and that capitalism is fundamentally about the conflict between workers and capitalists. Capitalists own the means of production, workers have to work for them. Polanyi argues that at the heart of capitalism, the essential wrong or the essential contradiction of capitalism is that it makes three items: land, labor, and money, and says they are all commodities. The simple thought that undergirds all of Polanyi's thought is land, labor, and money cannot be pure, unrestricted commodities. Why not? Consider land. Land You own a plot of land. Well, let's say you want to dig a mine, a silver mine on your land. And this actually began to happen in 15th century Italy, around Florence. And they began to notice terrible things. In order to produce mines, you have to cut down the vineyards, get rid of the olive groves. And in order to smelt the ore, you have to cut down the forest because you need fuel. And if you cut down the forest, then you remove all the animals and all the birds that are necessary for food. And then, of course, you have to wash the ore, so you pollute the rivers and you pollute the streams, and you kill off all the fish and all the ecological habitat around it. And pretty soon, you cannot survive in Florence. You would have destroyed the ecological conditions of possibility for shared life. And the Florentians therefore made up laws against mining in the vicinity because it destroyed the material conditions for the possibility of social life together. The obvious thought is land is never a material thing. Land is part of an ecological habitat. Equally, labor, my labor power. Oh, of course, you can buy my labor. But when you buy my labor for 8 hours a day, you get the rest of me. You get this fleshy, all too hungry, all too needy, all too exhausted, all too irritable human body. So that labor power is not like coal. It's attached to a living, fragile, vulnerable human being. So labor, too, cannot be an unrestricted commodity, because if they are unrestricted commodities, then you're treating them as without limits in their treatment. A necessary condition for the possibility of removing labor from the market would be human rights. That's what human rights were designed to do. Human rights were designed to say human beings cannot be mere commodities. They must be treated differently. They cannot be just treated as if they are worth a certain amount of money. They must be taken to be living beings that are parts of community. What about land? We do not yet have a way of taking land out of the market. And the reason is we do not yet fully recognize that all land, every piece of land, is part of a wider ecological habitat. So an ecocide convention would be the effort to withdraw land from the market. In fact, it would make every piece of land on Earth still in private hands of private property, but regulated, because you could not use your land in any way you wish. You would have to use it in ways compatible with its ecological integrity. Now, in order to get this thought really going, I need a further thought, and it concerns international law. Because plainly the idea of an ecocide convention would be, as human rights would be, parts of international law. I do not expect when you came here you thought you were going to be talked to about the status and meaning of international law, and I apologize. When I began this project, I did not know that I would have to spend years reading law books and learning about the structure and meaning of international law. Here's my hypothesis about international law. At present, international law is an emergent but obstructed, let me get it right, sorry. International law is an emergent but stalled, obstructed, and fragmenting set of principles for international governance. And the question about international law is, what is preventing cosmopolitan international law, the laws of war, which every one of us at this moment are raging about not being applied where they should be applied, the laws of war? Why are they not in force? And the answer to this question, that they're not in force, I think has two sides. First, it has everything to do with the sovereign state. And secondly, it has everything to do with the notion of legal positivism. And those two things go together. Let me begin with legal positivism. Legal positivism is the view that all laws are merely positive. That is, they are valid if they have been legislated in accordance with agreed procedures for making, executing, and enforcing law. And they're agreed, these principles are agreed by the international community. And there are two universally agreed to sources of international law then, either custom or treaty. Treaties are voluntary agreements, hence treaty laws recognize state sovereignty by agreeing that states are not bound to laws they have not agreed to. And that is the way that the great powers like the USA, Russia, China, India prefer the world to be. They want no constraints on their activity by international law. That idea that laws should be valid only by consent, only by treaty, is rationally and morally incoherent. Consider the obvious case of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are acts of murder, rape, apartheid, imprisonment, disappearance of peoples, movements of populations that are systematic and directed at a civilian population. That is, they are directed at a civilian population of the very state that's supposed to be protecting those people, or directed at people and the state tolerates it, or directed at people and the state is incapable of protecting them. In each and every case of crimes against humanity, the state fails its number one simple basis, namely, protect the security of your population. If you can't protect the security of the people under your control, you're out of business. There's nothing you can do to justify your existence. But that means that when crimes against humanity occur, then it is the obligation of the international community to intervene. So the Nuremberg trials were in fact about crimes against humanity committed by the leaders of Nazi Germany. And the core thesis, I think, is, again, powerful. It simply says that in crimes against humanity, the very structure that is meant to be protecting people becomes a weapon against them, and ergo loses its authority and legitimacy. This entails that there must be foundational principles organizing international society that are in force whether or not you agree to them. That the very idea of state legitimacy depends upon them having legitimacy, and that means them fulfilling at least the basic task of protecting their own citizens. But we've always known this. That is, we've known that what makes law necessary is beyond contract, beyond treaty, is that in order to live together, we require social protection. We require principles of regulating our interactions. We require norms by which we share a life and organize our cooperative behavior. In modern states, those laws are constitutional laws. Constitutions have the business, right, of setting up the organization of the state, but also modern constitutions have the job of providing rights to individuals. So when we are members of a state, we agree to something actually quite extraordinary. We actually agree to share our fates, how we live with our fellow citizens. And not only do we agree to this, we actually make weird sacrifices for it. Some sacrifices are easy. We pay our taxes. We sacrifice money. Sometimes sacrifices are deeper. We sacrifice time and serve in certain ways. But we sacrifice something even more basic just to be in a state, namely our freedom. We agree to regulate our freedom so that we can share our freedom, that no one is free unless everyone is free. That is basic. So the very idea of living together is agreeing to share one another's fate, to come to one another's rescue, to prop one another up. And now, that condition of needing to share one another's fate cannot stop at the boundary of the nation state. That climate catastrophe is an existential threat such that we are going to share the existential fate of everyone on earth. That no one can now separate what is going to happen to him and her with respect to the environment apart from how things go for everyone, because the very nature of the destruction of Holocene nature is that it has disrupted the climate system, it has perturbed the Holocene system, and therefore we can only intervene and do something about it collectively and on a global scale. So the thought is that climate change brings about a new human condition, a human condition in which we are thrown together such that we cannot separate our fate from the fate of fellow Earth citizens. What would this involve? First, obviously, an ecocide convention. But what we need, and here's the question. Now let's go back to human rights. Let's go back to the human rights question. This will be my last run of thought, another 7 or 8 minutes. The necessary condition for human historical civilization has been the self-regulating, stable, and moderate temperatures of Holocene nature. Fossil fuel capitalism has destroyed that. Remember where I started. In destroying Holocene nature, climate and climate-related deaths have now become a slow, genocidal ecocide. But this slow, genocidal ecocide is directed mostly at the most vulnerable people on Earth, especially in the global South, and that's why it is genocidal. It is not about an innocent selection of who dies. It is the most vulnerable and those who did least. In not acting, I want to be clear, we are complicit in this slow, genocidal ecocide. We are murderers. We have reason to act. We have reason to act. We are in a climate emergency, and anything approaching collective action would occur under the heading of emergency ethics. The idea that we can just do ordinary justice is done. We require emergency ethics, and this thought, by the way, is also the leading thought of Maya Groff's idea for climate governance, that the UN should announce, and every state and nation in the world should announce, a climate emergency. What are the steps? Philosophers are probably bad at steps, but I'll say a few things. First, mitigation. The obvious thought is we have to stop emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, stop destroying ecological habitats, and we have to stop very, very soon. The thought is by 2050, 2060, there has to be zero emissions. So far, we're not even beginning. We're not even beginning because while we are developing renewables, we have not stopped building and constructing fossil fuel sources of energy. Step two, if there's going to be a mitigation, then there has to be enforcement. what do I think is possible for enforcement? How could we democratize international law? And my thought is we can democratize international law by fully buying into the idea of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is the thesis that any state with a well-ordered judiciary and a well-ordered justice system can prosecute anyone who breaks an international law. Now, I want to be clear. I do not believe that the great powers are going to tolerate an international ecocide convention, and I do not believe that the great powers are going to let the notion of universal jurisdiction really happen in a forceful way. But the threat could be immense if the popular will of people that this is what we need, by every state introducing ecocide conventions, claiming they want universal jurisdiction, that might frighten some people into action. Number 3, back to human rights. What would it mean to provide the most vulnerable of our Earth's citizens with the necessary conditions for full and active participation in the life of their society? Standard human rights are not going to be enough. And the reason it will not be enough is because the most distressed of our fellow Earth citizens suffer from what I call double helplessness. Not only are they impoverished and homeless and without food or education or health care, but being in that condition makes them further vulnerable to environmental destruction. So what is a precarious situation becomes a deadly one. Hence, since they are more vulnerable to flood, heat, drought, hurricane, tornado, forest fires, and the like, then they require not just the ordinary resources, but they require the conditions for adaptation to environmental change. So, they require forms of infrastructure that will allow them to cope. So adaptation is about infrastructure. We know the Dutch at the moment, Netherlands, they know an awful lot about coping with water. That technology is going to be necessary for countries around the world. Coping with heat, coping with storm, coping with changing agricultural conditions. All these are going to be necessary, and they are going to need support in producing them. So what is required for human rights is human rights require resources for the production of infrastructure adequate to deal with climate change. And this cannot be just money. This cannot be just giving funds to the global south. They will require knowledge, they will require help, they will require supplies, they will require engineers and doctors and nurses and teachers and waste disposal engineers and supply chain experts. They are going to require us, international civilian corps, to go and be part of building this new social and material infrastructure. Dealing with climate change is not about money. It is going to be impossibly labor intensive. And it will be all of us who will need to be involved. Now the worrying thought is all that could fail. All that could fail. That we may go and do everything we can, and the environment is so bad that it will not stand this. What then is required of us? Clearly, under those conditions, every person has a human right to refuge. That we will be required to share their ethical fate by sharing our lives here in our homes, in our towns, in our cities with them, because it is we who put them in that predicament. The demand for human rights, I'm suggesting, is the idea of providing people with the possibility of full and equal lives, and providing them with the possibility or the right of refuge should that fail. And we put them in that position. Hence, my further claim is human rights, that if you ask what we owe the worst off for colonialism, for imperialism, for exploitation, we owe them exactly all of that. Not cash, but a life of decency. And a life of decency is the life of human rights. So human rights for the 21st century would be the right to dignity, by having a right to reparations, and reparations are the right to adaptation and refuge.